The Galactic Council ordered Earth to kneel. Humanity stood up. The transmission came in at 3:47 hours, and it was not a request. I was sitting at my desk in Geneva Command, running signal analysis on a routine deep space relay when every screen in the building went white. Not a glitch, not a test. Every single monitor, every holoboard, every display panel in the entire complex shut down its existing feed and loaded the same image. The Galactic Council seal, 3 golden rings interlocked over a field of deep violet, surrounded by the sigil marks of 47 member species. My name is Yara Osai. I'm a commander in the UN Aerospace Defense Division, and I have spent 11 years studying alien communication patterns, signal behavior, and the very specific way that powerful civilizations deliver bad news. I knew within 3 seconds that this was not a diplomatic overture. The seal was not centered. It was positioned in the upper left corner of the frame, which in Voreth visual protocol means authority is asserting itself downward. It was a posture. A declaration. They were standing over us before they had even spoken a word. The voice that followed was translated instantly by our systems into every human language simultaneously. In English, it sounded calm, smooth, almost polite. But I was listening to the original Voreth syllable stream underneath, and it was clipped, precise. The sound of someone reading a sentence they had already decided could not be argued with. The grand spokesman of the Voreth hegemony, speaking on behalf of the Galactic Council's Regulatory Commission, informed Earth and all its inhabited territories that we were in violation of Expansion Statute 7, subsection 4, clause 9. Our 3 outer moon colonies, Callisto Base, Ganymede Station, and the new settlement on Titan's eastern shelf, had been established beyond the boundary coordinates assigned to Earth at our provisional membership signing 40 years ago. The Council had reviewed the matter thoroughly. The conclusion was that humanity had expanded without authorization, without petition, and without approval. The demands were simple. Earth would surrender all colony vessels operating beyond the permitted zone. Earth would begin immediate and verifiable dismantlement of the 3 outer settlements. Earth would submit to a full compliance fleet inspection within 30 days. Failure to meet any of these conditions would result in orbital sanctions, including the suspension of all trade routes, communication relays, and transit corridors that connected Earth to any Council member world. Then the screen went back to normal, as if nothing had happened. For about 4 seconds, the entire building was completely silent. Then every phone, every comm channel, and every alert system went off at once, and I was already pulling up the original Voreth broadcast stream before the first call hit my desk. My supervisor, Colonel Henry Marsh, appeared in my doorway looking like he had aged 5 years in the last 2 minutes. He was a steady man, 28 years in uniform, not easily shaken. He looked shaken. "Osai," he said, "Secretary General's office is calling every senior analyst they can reach. We need assessments on the table by 600. "I need the full audio archive of that transmission," I said. "Not the translated version, the original signal." He stared at me for a moment. "You think the translation is wrong?" "I think the translation is accurate," I said. "I want to hear what they sound like when they think no one is paying attention to the original." He nodded and left. I turned back to my screen and began pulling the raw signal file. What I found was not in the words. The Voreth language uses mandibular resonance as an emotional subtext layer, a secondary communication channel that runs beneath the primary speech pattern and carries what we would call tone. Most translation software strips it out because it is difficult to map to human emotional equivalents. But I had spent 3 years building a personal analysis key, cross-referencing recorded Voreth broadcasts against their subsequent political actions, and I had learned to read that subtext the way you learn to read a person's expression while they are smiling at you. I ran the resonance pattern from the grand spokesman's address through my key. It took the system 8 minutes to process. The result stopped me completely. The dominant resonance signature across the entire address was not authority. It was not contempt, or superiority, or the quiet confidence of a civilization that has been making these kinds of announcements for 200,000 years. The dominant signature was one I had only seen twice before in my entire archive. Once in a Vorath emergency session, following the collapse of their eastern trade corridor, and once in a private communication between two Vorath ministers that had been leaked accidentally during a signal relay error 14 years ago. It was the resonance signature for urgency under concealment, the Vorath word that approximated it most closely translated, imperfectly, as the feeling of needing to act quickly before someone else does. They were not announcing from a position of patience. They were rushing. Something about humanity's outer colonies had made them move faster than they wanted to, and they had dressed it up in the language of calm regulatory enforcement because they did not want us to know they were in a hurry. I wrote up my report in 40 minutes. I marked it Priority Alpha and sent it to every senior analyst address I had access to, including 3 people at the Secretary General's office. I never received a single response. By 600, the building was full of diplomats, and the conversation had already moved entirely into the language of compliance and negotiation. How much could we give? How fast could we give it? Which colonies were most valuable, and which ones could be sacrificed to show good faith? I sat in the back of the briefing room and watched the Secretary General's face on the main screen as the diplomatic team laid out their options. He was a careful man named Oliver Bright, 61 years old, former international law professor, deeply experienced in the kind of careful, patient multilateral negotiation that had defined Earth's first 40 years of council membership. He listened to everything with his hands folded on the table, and when they finished, he asked one question. What happens if we simply do not comply? There was a pause, and then the lead diplomatic advisor, a woman named Carol Fenn, began explaining the consequences in measured, professional language. Orbital sanctions, trade disruption, communication blackout, political isolation from 47 species. I watched Oliver Bright's face as she spoke. He was not afraid. He was calculating. There is a difference, and it is visible if you know what to look for. He was running numbers in his head that had nothing to do with the consequences Carol Fenn was describing. I pulled out my tablet and sent him a direct message, just one line. The Vorath are nervous. I have the resonance data. Read my report. He glanced at his tablet, then looked up and scanned the room until his eyes found me in the back row. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Carol Fenn and let her finish. After the briefing, he did not walk toward the diplomatic team. He walked toward me. Commander Osei, he said quietly, send that report again. This time mark it for my eyes only. I had it in his inbox before he reached the door. I did not know what he would do with it. I did not know if it would change anything. What I knew, sitting in that room with the Vorath's 30-day clock already ticking, was that someone at the top had at least asked the right question. Not what do we give them, but what happens if we don't. That was not nothing. In fact, in that moment it felt like everything. I went back to my desk, pulled up 40 years of council expansion statute enforcement records and started reading. I did not sleep that night. I was looking for something specific, the pattern that sits underneath the rules, the one that tells you not what the law says, but what it is actually for. I found it by morning, and it was worse than I expected, not because of what it said, because of what it revealed about why they were in such a hurry. They had let us get this far on purpose, and now, for reasons the statute never explained, they needed us to step back. Not because we had broken a rule, because we had gotten close enough to something they did not want us to find. I did not know what that something was yet, but I intended to find out. I boarded the transport to Luna Prime on day 4 of the 30-day window. The terminal at Geneva Launch Facility was loud and crowded, full of journalists, aid workers, and families trying to reach relatives who lived in the outer settlements. Security had doubled. Officers in full uniform were stationed at every corridor, not because anyone had done anything wrong, but because authority instinctively tightens its grip when things feel uncertain. I had requested the Luna Prime assignment myself, and after 2 days of silence, Henry Marsh had approved it with a note that said only, "Go quickly." The journey took 6 hours. I spent most of it reading the expansion statute enforcement archive I had pulled the night before. In 40 years of council membership, the statute had been cited 41 times against various member species. Of those 41 cases, 39 had resulted in immediate compliance. The compliant species had all received formal commendations from the Council, restoration of full trade access within 90 days, and a modest expansion of their permitted zones within the following decade, as a reward for cooperation. The other 2 cases were different. I had to dig through restricted archive layers to find them, and what I found was that the records had not been deleted, but summarized, condensed into a single paragraph each, stripped of detail, filed under administrative outcomes concluded. What the paragraph said, in careful bureaucratic language, was that both species had refused initial compliance, and that matters had been resolved through alternative regulatory engagement. No further explanation was provided. I had spent an hour trying to find any record of what alternative regulatory engagement meant for those 2 species. I found nothing. The species themselves still existed, were still council members, still appeared in trade and communication records, but their expansion zones had never grown again after the incident, not once in the following century. They had stopped reaching outward, both of them, and stayed exactly where the council had told them to stay. They had not been destroyed, they had been contained. I kept that thought in the back of my mind, as the transport descended through the pale haze above Luna Prime's habitat dome. The settlement was larger than most Earth residents understood. Official population figures listed Luna Prime at 340,000 people, but the actual resident count was closer to 480,000 when you included the rotating labor crews, the long-term contractors, and the families who had quietly decided that they preferred a life with lower gravity, cleaner air recycling, and fewer political complications than anything Earth's surface currently offered. 3 full generations had been born here. The oldest permanent resident, a retired tunnel engineer named Harold Cross, was 89 years old and had not set foot on Earth in over 50 years. He had told an interviewer once that he no longer thought of himself as a person who lived off-world. He thought of himself as a person who lived here, and Earth was the place he was originally from. I met the settlement administrator at the East Operations Hub, a direct and competent woman named Patricia Hale, who had managed Luna Prime's logistics for 9 years. She shook my hand firmly, offered me coffee, and before I could ask a single question, she told me that the evacuation transport the UN had sent 3 days ago was still sitting at Pad 7 with 0 passengers aboard. "How many were scheduled?" I asked. 600 on the first wave, she said. "Mostly families with young children, people who wanted to go voluntarily. We expected it to be straightforward." "What happened?" She looked at me steadily. "They changed their minds, all of them." She walked me to Pad 7. The transport was a large vessel, full capacity 800, and it sat in its berth completely empty, attended only by its crew of 12 who were playing a card game in the lower hold. Outside the pad's observation window, I could see the settlement's main residential corridor, long and curved with light panels overhead and planters along the center walk. People were moving through it normally, going about their day, not running, not panicking, not doing anything dramatic. They were simply not leaving. I asked to meet some of them, and Patricia brought me to the community hall in residential Block 4. It held maybe 200 people when I arrived, and within 30 minutes it held closer to 400, because word spread quickly that someone had come from Geneva to talk to them. What I had expected was fear or anger, or the complicated mix of both that tends to define moments of political crisis. What I found was something else entirely. They were calm. Not the calm of people who had not understood the situation, but the calm of people who had understood it very clearly and made a decision. An older man named George Adler, who had worked the mining tunnels for 22 years, told me quietly that he had watched the council's transmission 3 times. He had read every piece of analysis available through the public feeds, and he had come to a conclusion he could not shake, which was that the council's statute had always existed. It had been on the books for 40 years. Nobody had enforced it during those 40 years. Not once. Not even when Earth's settlements on Callisto and Ganymede were clearly visible to every council monitoring system. They had watched us build those settlements, year by year, dome by dome, and said nothing. And now they want us gone in 30 days. He shook his head. That's not a law being enforced. That's a door being shut. I did not argue with him. He was right, and I was not there to persuade him to leave. Then I met Abina QC. She was 73 years old, small and entirely composed, seated in a chair near the back of the hall with the stillness of someone who had decided something a long time ago and had not needed to revisit it since. Her daughter had been born on Luna Prime. Her granddaughter had been born here. Her family had arrived as part of the first civilian settlement wave, part of a broader effort to establish that space was not only for governments and corporations and carefully selected astronauts, but for ordinary people who wanted something different. She looked at me for a moment after we were introduced, and then she said, "My grandmother did not cross the Atlantic in a cargo hold so that I could kneel on the moon." The room was very quiet when she said it. I have replicated that sentence in my personal log more times than I can count since that day, not because it requires analysis, but because some sentences do not require analysis. They require only to be heard. I spent 2 days on Luna Prime, and I interviewed 63 residents across multiple blocks and community groups. What emerged was not a coordinated resistance movement. There was no organization behind it, no leader who had sent a signal, no political group that had mobilized its members. These people had each independently watched the same transmission, read the same news, sat with the same facts, and arrived at the same conclusion. They were not going to leave. What struck me most was not the decision itself, but what it revealed about the people who had made it. I had grown up reading human history, and I knew the arguments about human nature, the idea that people choose safety when survival is threatened, that the rational individual calculates risk and retreats when the odds are against them. Every political and diplomatic model that Earth's Council advisors had built was grounded in that assumption. The Council itself appeared to operate on that assumption. Push hard enough, and the organism retreats. But sitting in that community hall on Luna Prime, surrounded by 400 people who had quietly and firmly decided that they were staying, I began to understand something that I had been circling in my analysis for days without being able to name. Humans do not only calculate risk to themselves, they calculate risk to something they consider worth more than themselves. And when that calculation tips in favor of the larger thing, the personal survival calculus stops being the dominant factor. What these people were protecting was not a moon base. It was the idea that they had the right to be there, that their children had the right to be there, that the distance between Earth and the nearest star was not a fence someone else got to decide the height of. That was the thing the Council's models had not accounted for. The Voreth hegemony had sent ultimatums to 39 species, and 39 species had calculated personal and collective survival, compared it to the cost of resistance, and complied. They had all been rational. They had all been reasonable. And they had all stopped growing. On the evening of Day 5, I was reviewing my notes in the operations hub when a message arrived through a heavily encrypted relay channel. The sender identifier was masked, but the routing signature put its origin somewhere in Voreth administrative space, which meant either it was a trap or it was exactly what it appeared to be. A communication from someone inside the Voreth system who had decided to take an enormous risk. The message was 7 words, that was all. Your history files are the most read. Below it a name, Vreth, no title, no position, no further context. I read it 4 times. Then I sent a single acknowledgement pulse back through the relay and closed the channel. I did not know who Vreth was. I did not know what the message fully meant. But I knew what humanity's history files contained, and I knew why a member of a civilization that had watched thousands of species rise and fall over 200,000 years might find them compelling enough to read obsessively. We had done everything wrong by every rational model. We had fought each other, nearly destroyed ourselves multiple times, fallen apart and rebuilt, lost everything and started again. By any sensible metric, we should not have made it this far. And yet here we were, on the moon, refusing to leave. I boarded the return transport on day 6 and spent the journey writing the longest analysis of my career. I titled it simply, Why They Are Afraid and What It Means for Us. When I landed in Geneva, I sent it to Oliver Bright. This time, his response came within the hour. "Come to my office," he wrote, "bring everything." The Emergency Assembly of the United Nations had never been called under conditions quite like these. Every previous emergency session in the body's 230-year history had been called in response to events on Earth, conflicts between nations, environmental crises, economic collapses, the kind of problems that the Assembly had been designed to address. This was the first time it had been called because something outside the planet had issued a demand, and the planet needed to decide whether to answer it. I was not supposed to speak. My name was not on the agenda. The morning session was scheduled for diplomatic presentations from the 3 major advisory blocks, followed by a closed consultation period, followed by a preliminary vote on which negotiating framework to adopt for the response to the Council. I had requested a speaking slot 4 days earlier. The request had been declined twice by the scheduling committee, and then approved on the 3rd attempt after Oliver Bright personally intervened. He had not told me what to say. He had only told me that I had 20 minutes and that I should say what I actually believed, because the Assembly had already heard 6 days of what people thought they should believe, and it had not produced anything useful. I walked to the podium at 11:47 in the morning, in front of 193 national delegations, 12 observer states, and an estimated global live audience of 4.2 billion people. I did not start with an introduction. I did not thank anyone for the opportunity. I started with a number. 41, I said. That is how many times the Voreth hegemony has cited Expansion Statute 7 against a member species. 39 of those species complied immediately. 2 did not, initially, and both eventually reached what the Council records call alternative regulatory outcomes. I spent a significant amount of time trying to understand what that phrase means. The records do not explain it directly. But both species involved stopped expanding their territories permanently following the resolution. Not temporarily, not for a decade, permanently. They are still Council members. They are still present in trade and communication records, but they stopped growing and they have not started again. I paused and looked out at the chamber. That is what compliance costs, I said. Not your colonies, your future. There was movement in the room. Not noise, but a physical shift, the subtle realignment of attention that happens when a room decides it is listening. I laid out the case I had been building for 6 days. I did not use emotional language. I used data, records, patterns, and one central analytical argument. The Voreth hegemony was not enforcing a regulation. It was managing a threat assessment. The expansion statute had been on the record for a century. Earth had been visibly building its outer settlements for 14 years. Not once, in 14 years, had a single council monitoring system flagged a violation, issued a warning, or initiated a procedural review. The settlements were not hidden. They were documented in every council observation log. The hegemony had known about them since the first foundation beam was placed on Callisto. They had waited, and then 6 days ago they had moved. Something had changed. Not our behavior, which had been consistent for over a decade. Something in their calculation had shifted. The message from Vreth had confirmed it in 7 words, but even without that message, the data spoke clearly. The Voreth were in a hurry because something about humanity's trajectory had moved across a threshold they had been quietly monitoring. We are not in trouble because we broke a rule, I told the chamber. We are in trouble because we got close enough to something they do not want us to reach. I do not yet know what that something is, but I know that every species that has ever complied with a Voreth ultimatum has never found out either. They stopped. And stopping is what the hegemony requires, not because of the statute, but because of what lies on the other side of it. I moved to the second part of my argument, which was the part I had been most uncertain about, because it required me to ask the Assembly to consider something that no diplomatic body in history had formally considered: the strategic value of being visibly difficult. I pulled up the enforcement data again and walked them through it from a different angle. 39 compliant species, 2 non-compliant. The compliant species had all received their zones back within a decade and been permitted modest, carefully regulated expansion since. But I pointed out something that was visible in the long-term data only if you looked across centuries rather than decades. None of the compliant species had ever, in the entire recorded history of the Council, achieved a zone expansion that the Vorath had not pre-approved. Their growth had continued, but it had continued within corridors that the hegemony had defined for them, at a pace the hegemony had found acceptable. They are not trying to stop us permanently, I said. They are trying to train us. They want to establish right now at this moment that Earth asks permission before it reaches. Because once that pattern is established, it never needs to be enforced again. You internalize it. You teach it to your children. You stop imagining the space beyond the approved boundary as yours. You start imagining it as theirs. I let that sit for a moment. I was on Luna Prime 4 days ago, I continued. I spoke with 400 residents who were scheduled for voluntary evacuation and chose not to go. Not one of them was a politician. Not one of them was a military officer or a diplomat or an analyst. They were engineers and miners and teachers and grandparents. One woman told me something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since she said it. She said that her grandmother did not cross the Atlantic in a cargo hold so that she could kneel on the moon. The chamber was very still. I am not standing here to recommend that we go to war with the Galactic Council, I said clearly. I am not recommending that we point weapons at anyone or escalate this into a confrontation that would be militarily catastrophic for Earth. What I am recommending is something that will terrify the hegemony far more than any weapon we have. I activated the main display behind me and brought up the proposal I had drafted. Documented public broadcast noncompliance. We do not comply. We do not close the settlements. We do not surrender the colony vessels. And we broadcast that decision with our full legal and analytical reasoning on every council-accessible frequency we have. We make our case, transparently and in full detail, to every other species in council space. We invite them to examine the enforcement record themselves. We ask them to compare the statute's application to Earth against its application, or non-application, to the Vorath hegemony's own expansion history. I brought up the second data panel. In the last 200 years, the Vorath have expanded their permitted zone 14 times. Each expansion was approved by the Council after the fact, retroactively. Following a period of unauthorized settlement that looks, in the historical record, almost identical to what Earth has done. The difference is that nobody called it a violation when the Vorath did it. The statute was not cited. No compliance fleet was mobilized. The Council simply approved what had already happened and updated the maps. I heard movement again, sharper this time, from several delegation sections. We are not asking the Council to break its own rules, I said. We are asking it to apply them consistently. We are asking, in public, on every frequency available to us, in a way that every species in council space can observe and evaluate. The hegemony cannot sanction us without making that inconsistency the most visible political fact in the galaxy, and we have reason to believe they are not prepared to absorb that visibility right now. I did not mention Vreth by name. I did not reveal the message. But I made clear that we had reason to believe the hegemony's internal political situation was not as unified as the Grand Spokesman's transmission had suggested. They need this to be over quickly, I said. They need us to comply before anyone looks too closely at why they moved so fast and why now. The longer this stays public, the more uncomfortable it becomes for them. Our best tool is not resistance in the traditional sense. It is transparency. We shine a light on the mechanism, and we let the mechanism explain itself to the rest of the council. I looked at the chamber one last time. 3 council species have, in the last week, quietly requested observer access to the diplomatic proceedings Earth has been conducting. They have not done this publicly. They have not announced it, but they asked. That tells you something about the political landscape inside the council right now. We are not as isolated as the hegemony wants us to believe. The question is not whether we can survive this confrontation. The question is whether we are willing to have it. I had been speaking for 19 minutes. I stopped there. The vote was called 3 hours later. It required a 2/3 majority of present delegations to authorize the public noncompliance strategy, which meant 129 votes. The final count was 144 in favor. Earth was not going to comply. In the operations center, as the results came through, Henry Marsh put his hand on my shoulder and said nothing. He did not need to. Across the solar system, the compliance fleet had already begun mobilizing. 40 Vorath warships were preparing to make the journey to our sun. The clock was still running. We had 23 days left, and everything that came next was going to happen in full view of the galaxy. I hoped we were ready for that. I believed we were. But belief and readiness are 2 different things, and the next 23 days were going to test the distance between them. I will tell you exactly what it felt like to face 40 Vorath warships with 11 of our own. It felt like standing at the edge of a very high place and choosing not to step back. Not because you are not afraid. You are afraid. Every reasonable part of your mind is producing very clear and logical reasons why stepping back is the sensible option. But there is another part of you, quieter and more stubborn, that has already made a different calculation and is not interested in being talked out of it. I was aboard the flagship of Earth's defensive formation, a vessel called the Adamantine, a name chosen by the crew 4 years ago when it was commissioned, from an old word meaning unbreakable. It had been built as a deep space survey ship. We had retrofitted it with defense arrays and positioned it because it was the largest hull we had available, not because it was designed for what we were asking it to do. Our 11 ships were positioned at the Jupiter corridor on day 26 of the 30-day window. The Jupiter corridor is the most efficient approach vector to the inner solar system from outer council space, a gravitational channel that reduces transit time by roughly 40% compared to any other route. If you are coming to Earth with a fleet, and you know what you are doing, you come through Jupiter. We knew that. We had known it since our first council membership briefing 40 years ago. So we were there. The Vorath fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at 6:12 hours, 140,000 kilometers beyond our formation. On the sensor display, they appeared as 40 bright contacts, arranged in a forward wedge pattern. Standard Vorath approach formation for regulatory enforcement operations. It was the same formation they had used in 39 previous compliance actions. I was in the command chair when they appeared. My crew was at stations, every screen live, every system green. The air in the command module was very still. My communications officer, a young man named Owen Dale, looked up from his panel and said, "They are broadcasting on Council standard frequencies. The Admiral is requesting immediate channel." "Open it," I said. The Vorath Admiral's image appeared on the main screen. His name, according to our intelligence files, was Fleet Director Kethon, a 20-year veteran of hegemony enforcement operations and considered one of their more capable commanders. He looked at me without expression, which is the Vorath default. Their facial structure does not permit the kind of micro-expressions that human faces generate, but the mandible movement patterns I had spent years studying were visible even through the signal compression. He told me that Earth had failed to meet its compliance obligations. He told me that the compliance fleet was present to enforce the Council's regulatory requirements. He told me that Earth's defensive formation should stand aside immediately and allow the fleet to proceed to inter-system coordinates for inspection purposes. He spoke for 90 seconds. The entire time his mandibles were clicking in a pattern I recognized immediately. It was the same pattern I had seen in the Grand Spokesman's original transmission: urgency under concealment, moving faster than comfortable, needing this concluded. "Fleet Director," I said, "Earth acknowledges your presence and respectfully declines to stand aside." There was a pause. His mandibles shifted to a pattern I had not seen before, which made me pay very close attention. "Commander," he said, "you are 11 vessels, I am 40. Compliance is not optional." "With respect," I said, "the question isn't whether compliance is optional. The question is what happens after you make it mandatory, and I think you already know the answer to that, or you would have come sooner." Another pause, longer this time. I turned to Owen. "Activate the broadcast array. Full spectrum, Council standard encoding, addressed to all receiving stations." Owen's hands moved across his panel. "Active," he said. "We are live on 73 Council frequencies." I looked back at the Admiral. "Fleet Director, I want to make sure that what happens next is visible to everyone who should be watching. Whatever you decide to do, the galaxy will be able to evaluate it clearly." I had spent the last 8 days preparing for this moment with a team of 3 analysts and 2 Council diplomatic observers who had quietly come aboard at Titan before the fleet arrived. We had constructed the most comprehensive legal and historical brief ever assembled by a human institution, covering 200 years of expansion statute enforcement data, Vorath zone expansion history, and a detailed comparison of the regulatory treatment applied to Earth against the treatment applied to every other species that had ever been subject to the statute. Every Council species with a receiving station had been sent a compressed data package the previous evening, timed to arrive approximately 6 hours before the Vorath fleet's expected transit. The package was formatted in Council Standard, translated into 17 primary galactic languages, and clearly labeled as an official submission from Earth's Aerospace Defense Division to the Galactic Council's Regulatory Commission for independent review. We had also included Vreth's original 7-word message, with full routing data attached, as an exhibit. That last element had been the most debated decision of the entire operation. Vreth had taken an enormous risk by contacting us. Using the message publicly potentially exposed the sender, even without a name attached. I had spent 2 nights arguing with myself about it, and in the end I had concluded that the routing data, stripped of any sender identification but intact enough to prove it originated from within Vorath administrative space, was too important to withhold. It demonstrated, without any possibility of fabrication, that there were voices inside the hegemony itself that had found it necessary to warn us. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of crack in a unified political front that the rest of the Council would notice and remember. Fleet Director Kethan looked at me for a long moment. His mandibles were now moving in a pattern I had never documented before, which meant I was watching something genuinely new. "You are transmitting," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. He was silent. 40 warships sat 140,000 kilometers from my 11, close enough that the gap was almost meaningless at engagement speeds, far enough that nothing had happened yet. I watched the sensor display. The Vorath formation was not moving. No approach vectors were being plotted. The fleet was holding position. 30 minutes passed. Owen Dale turned from his panel and said quietly, "Commander, we're getting signals from 3 Council transponders. The Usseler Compact, the Dremok Assembly, and the Pale Collective are all broadcasting formal observer status notifications on Council regulatory frequencies." I exhaled very slowly. We had expected 1, possibly 2. 3 was better than we had hoped. "The Usseler are also broadcasting a formal inquiry," Owen continued, his voice steady, "addressed to the Council Regulatory Commission, requesting documentation of all expansion statute enforcement actions in the last 2 centuries, with specific reference to comparative application standards." That was the needle that moved the thread. A formal regulatory inquiry from a Council member species, submitted in public on record during an active enforcement operation. It did not stop the Vorath legally, but it reframed everything that happened next. If the fleet director proceeded now, he was not conducting a routine compliance action. He was conducting an enforcement operation under active scrutiny from multiple member species, with a public inquiry into the statute's consistency of application already on the record. Every action the fleet took would be evaluated against that inquiry's findings. The political cost had shifted from manageable to significant. 1 hour passed. 40 ships sat at the edge of our solar system and did not move. I ate a meal at my station because it seemed important to do normal things. Owen brought me coffee. The crew worked quietly. The sensors showed the Vorath formation unchanged, and the council frequencies carried an increasingly active exchange between the Usseler, the Dremok, and several other species whose transponders were beginning to appear in the data stream. 2 hours. 3. At the 4-hour mark, Fleet Director Kethon's channel opened again without my requesting it. His image appeared on the main screen, and I looked at his mandibles before I looked at anything else. The urgency pattern was still there, but something had changed in the secondary resonance signature beneath it. The closest human equivalent I could map it to was the specific quality of a calculation being revised in real time. "Commander Osai," he said, "this matter will be referred to the Council's Regulatory Commission for full review. The fleet will maintain position pending Commission instruction." "We appreciate that," I said. "Earth will cooperate fully with any Commission review." He closed the channel. 14 hours after the Vorath fleet had arrived at the edge of our solar system, the first ship rotated its approach vector and jumped to faster than light. Then the second. Then 5 more within the following hour. By the end of the day, the sensor display that had shown 40 contacts showed 0. They were gone. I sat in the command chair for a long time after the last contact disappeared. My hands were resting on my knees, and I noticed that they were not entirely steady. The steadiness had been there for the entire operation because it needed to be, because a command post is not a place where you show the crew what your hands are actually doing. But now the command post was quiet and the fleet was gone, and the solar system was just the solar system again. And my hands were telling me what the rest of me already knew, which was that I had been more afraid than I had let myself acknowledge. I thought about Abina Cusey in her chair in the community hall on Luna Prime. I thought about George Adler and his 22 years in the tunnels. I thought about Harold Cross, 89 years old and entirely certain about where home was. We had not been the only ones holding the line. They had been holding it too. Every day they stayed. Every day they refused to board the transport. Every day they simply continued being exactly where they had decided to be. Owen Dale looked over from his station. "Commander," he said, "Luna Prime is broadcasting. They would like to know if they should continue normal operations." I smiled. It felt like the first genuine, uncalculated smile I had produced in 3 weeks. "Tell them," I said, "that normal operations are exactly what they should continue." 6 months after the fleet returned home, I was sitting in a small cafe in Geneva with an alien. Vreth was shorter than I had expected, and broader, with the characteristic gray-green skin tone of Vorath from the northern hemispheric regions of their homeworld. He wore a loose coat in a dark blue color that I recognized from council diplomatic briefings as a neutral status garment, the Vorath equivalent of coming to a meeting in ordinary clothes rather than a uniform or ceremonial dress. He had arrived on Earth 3 weeks earlier, transported aboard a Usseler diplomatic vessel, after his asylum application had been processed through channels that had moved considerably faster than standard immigration procedure usually permitted. Oliver Bright had personally signed the approval. Vreth wrapped both of his primary hands around his coffee cup and examined the contents with what I had learned, over 2 previous meetings, was genuine curiosity. He had taken to coffee with an enthusiasm that had surprised me. He had told me during our second meeting that the Vorath did not have anything that produced a comparable sensory response, and that he found the experience of being mildly caffeinated profoundly interesting from a neurological perspective. "The Commission has completed its review," he said. His translator module rendered his voice in a precise, slightly formal English that I had stopped finding strange after the first 10 minutes of our first conversation. The expansion statute is being referred to the full council for structural amendment. The enforcement record you submitted was more comprehensive than anything the Commission had previously seen assembled in one document. Several Commission members were apparently unaware of the full pattern themselves. Or they were aware and preferred not to have it documented so clearly, I said. Vreth tilted his head in the small side-to-side motion that I had identified as his equivalent of a conceding gesture. Both are possible. Institutional awareness is not the same as individual awareness. Systems can operate consistently without every participant understanding the full scope of what they are participating in. Outside the cafe window, Lake Geneva was pale silver in the morning light. Across the water, I could see the launch facility's distant glow, and if I looked up and slightly right, I could find the slow-moving brightness of a colony transport rising through the atmosphere on its way to orbit. The launch schedule had not been interrupted for a single day during the entire crisis period. Oliver Bright had insisted on it, partly as a practical matter and partly as a statement. We keep going, that is what we do. 3 things happened politically that we did not fully anticipate, I said. The Usseler moving first, the speed of the Dremok response, and the Pale Collective. I expected the Usseler because we had intelligence suggesting sympathy in their diplomatic corps. I did not expect the other 2 to move that fast. The Pale Collective has had a difficult relationship with the hegemony for approximately 60 years, Vreth said. The public record does not capture the full scope of that difficulty. The Dremok situation is more complex. There is a faction within their assembly that has been waiting for a political moment that would allow them to raise a regulatory consistency challenge without being isolated as the sole dissenting voice. Your situation provided cover. They were not acting out of sympathy for Earth specifically. They were acting out of an opportunity that Earth had created. I know, I said, and that's fine. Political motivations don't have to be pure to be useful. Vreth made a sound I had learned, was his form of quiet agreement. The hegemony is not finished with this, I said. It was not a question. No, he said. They are reassessing. The internal political situation is more fragmented than it was 6 months ago. The faction that authorized the original enforcement action has lost standing, but the underlying strategic concern has not changed. You are still expanding. You are still moving toward the outer boundary of your zone, and beyond it toward regions that the hegemony considers sensitive. Sensitive because of what's there, I asked, or sensitive because of what we might become if we reach it? He looked at me steadily. Both, he said, but the second reason is the primary one. I had suspected that for a long time. I had hoped he would confirm it eventually, and he just had. What did they think we would become? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he went quiet when he was deciding how much to say rather than what to say. I had learned the difference. With Vreth, hesitation meant calculation, not reluctance. He was precise about what he chose to share, not because he was withholding, but because he thought carefully about framing before he spoke. It was a quality I respected enormously. The Council has observed the emergence and development of 4,217 spacefaring civilizations over the period of its recorded history, he said. Of those, approximately 3,000 have been documented to full extinction or civilizational collapse before reaching what the Council's development taxonomy classifies as stable galactic participation. Of the remaining 1,200, the overwhelming majority reached stability through one of 2 mechanisms. Either they found a natural ceiling, some internal cultural or biological factor that reduced their rate of expansion to a sustainable and non-threatening level, or they were guided to stability through regulatory frameworks established by the Council in their early development period. He paused and looked at his coffee. Guided, I repeated, you mean contained. The language the Council uses is guided, he said. The effect in practice is what you described. And humans, I said, which category were we supposed to fall into? Neither, he said. That is the problem. Your development trajectory does not match either pattern. You have no natural ceiling that our modeling can identify. Your internal conflicts historically have not reduced your expansion rate. They have periodically disrupted it, and then it has resumed, usually at a faster pace than before the disruption. Your technology adoption curves do not plateau. Your population distribution patterns do not stabilize. Every model the hegemony has applied to your civilization over the last 40 years has underestimated you at the next measurement point. He looked at me with what I had come to recognize as his version of directness, a slight forward orientation of his upper body, and a focus of both primary eyes on my face. You are not a civilization that is growing toward something the Council has seen before, he said. You are a civilization that appears to be growing toward something it has not. The cafe was quiet around us. A family at the next table was eating breakfast, two children arguing gently about something in the uncomplicated way that children argue, the kind of argument that is really just a form of paying close attention to each other. I thought about what to say. I thought about Luna Prime and about the 400 people who had stayed, and about the launch transports that rose every morning from the pad across the lake. I thought about Callisto Base and Ganymede Station, and the new settlement on Titan's eastern shelf, all three still operating, all three still growing, the people inside them waking up every morning and going to work in the ordinary way that people do when they live somewhere they have decided is home. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes," Vreth said. "You told us in 7 words that our history files were the most read documents in Council space. I've wondered about that since the day I got that message. Why? What do you find in them that keeps people reading?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the lake moved in small, pale waves. The transport I had been watching earlier was gone from sight, already high enough to be beyond what I could see from ground level. "When the Council studies the development histories of civilizations," he said slowly, "there is a category of information that we designate as foundational narrative. The story a civilization tells about itself, about where it came from, what it survived, what it believes about its own nature. For most civilizations, the foundational narrative is a story of ascent, beginning from difficulty, progressing toward stability, arriving at a condition of sustained continuity. The narrative arc moves upward and then levels. It is, in the long view, a story about finding a place and remaining in it." He paused. "Human history files do not tell that story," he said. "They tell a different story, a story in which the ascent does not level, in which every arrival at stability is followed by a disruption that produces a new beginning, in which the thing that drives the civilization forward is not certainty about where it is going, but a specific quality that we do not have a precise word for in Vorath." He stopped and I waited. "The closest translation in your language," he said, "is something like the refusal to accept that the ceiling is real." I did not say anything for a moment. "We read your history files," he continued, "because they contain something we do not have records of anywhere else. A civilization that has been told, repeatedly, by circumstances and by entropy and by its own internal conflicts, that it has reached its limit, and has, every time, decided that the limit was someone else's assumption about it, and moved past it anyway." He picked up his coffee and held it in both hands. "The hegemony is afraid of you," he said, "not because of what you have done. You are, by every military and technological metric, significantly less advanced than a dozen council species. They are afraid of you because of what you appear to believe about yourselves. Because a civilization that does not accept the ceiling as real is a civilization that the council does not know how to model, and what cannot be modeled cannot be managed." I looked at him for a long time. "What happens now?" I asked. "With the Commission review, the statute amendment, all of it, what does it actually change?" "It changes the formal record," he said. "The statute will be amended to include consistency requirements that make targeted enforcement against a single species significantly harder to justify. Earth's 3 outer settlements will be formally recognized within an expanded zone that reflects actual settlement boundaries rather than the original provisional coordinates. The hegemony will not be able to repeat what they attempted, not through the same mechanism. But they will try something else, I said. Yes, he said simply. They will try something else. They are very patient and they have tried things before. And we will handle it, I said. He tilted his head in the conceding gesture. The historical probability, based on everything in your files, suggests that you will. He finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully, with the precise, deliberate movement that I had noticed was his habit, a quality of treating small actions as worthy of attention. I had come to find it one of his more appealing characteristics. I have been asked, he said, by the Usseler diplomatic representative who sponsored my asylum application to convey an informal question, not a political question, an informal one. Ask it, I said. They want to know if Earth would be willing to participate in an informal dialogue group with the Usseler, the Dremok, and possibly the Pale Collective. Not a formal council structure, not a treaty negotiation, simply a regular conversation between species who have found in recent events that they have some questions in common. I looked at him. Questions about what? About the ceiling, he said, about whether it is real. Outside the window, a second transport rose from the launch facility, slow and bright against the pale morning sky, catching the sun as it climbed. Inside it, several hundred people were beginning a journey to somewhere that 40 years ago did not exist as a place where people lived, and 20 years from now would be entirely unremarkable. Another human settlement in the ordinary catalog of places where ordinary life happened, where children argued about small things and parents drank coffee, and the day moved at the pace of things that have decided to stay. I watched the transport until it was too small to see. Then I looked at Vreth. Tell them yes, I said. We are very interested in that conversation. He made the small side-to-side tilt that meant concession or agreement, or perhaps something that sat between the two, a recognition that a thing had been decided, and the deciding was good. We sat for a while longer in the cafe by the lake, a human and an alien drinking coffee in the ordinary morning, while above us and across the system, and out toward the edge of the zone we had refused to shrink back from, the people who had stayed kept waking up and going to work, kept building the thing they had decided was worth building, kept reaching, in the very specific and ungovernable way that humans reach, toward whatever came next. The ceiling, as it turned out, had never been real. It had only been someone else's assumption. And we had never been particularly good at accepting those.